so today I'll be speaking about my experience with the Our Rights, Everyone's Rights Technical Assistance Program. So on the 27th to the 30th of July, Sandput, in collaboration with the International Network of People Use Drugs, funded the Our Rights, Everyone's Rights Drug Policy and Harm Reduction Technical Assistance Program. The training was attended by 14 participants ranging from multiple stakeholders across South Africa, from harm reduction centers, healthcare providers, and networks. Okay. So the goal and the outcomes achieved. The goal of the program was to promote and advance the community-led decriminalization agenda for people use drugs. It addressed the punitive, legal, and policy environments that resulted in the denial or limitation of services for people who use drugs, and increased the knowledge and capacity of community-led networks across the globe, across the new global HIV and harm reduction targets, community-led responses, human rights, and legal reform. Outcomes that were achieved in attending this workshop was that participants gained a better understanding of the extent of decriminalization for the possession, use, and cultivation of small amounts of drugs globally, and the impact of criminalization on health and human rights for people who use drugs. They too were given access to data on the impact of criminalization for use in their advocacy, and gained a better understanding of why it's important to familiarize yourself with data on various impacts of criminalization for the purpose of the advocacy. Okay, so what happened? Participants were divided in 3 groups and were asked to prioritize the fundamental advocacy issues and 3 related advocacy objectives. Specific activities guided participants through relevant policy content, declarations, and targets over the course of 4 days. The workshop included discussions on the national, regional, and instrumental landscapes of drug policy and criminalization, as well as the impact of drug users. Collaborative projects enable participants to put their new knowledge to use in developing advocacy plans, which were presented on the final day. On the second day, advocates of sex work decriminalization joined the workshop, providing an overview of their approach, challenges, and experiences with sex work decriminalization in South Africa. On the third day, the team visited a harm reduction outreach site where members of TB/HIV care were doing needle and syringe exchanges with beneficiaries, and this further enabled insights to advocacy and planning. So what was learned? We looked at the type of human rights violations experienced by people who use drugs, and human rights violations that were called into question were freedom of arbitrary arrest and detention, protection from torture and other forms of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment, freedom of association. We looked at various definitions such as depenalization, decriminalization, and legalization. We looked at the impact of criminalization on drug use for people who use drugs, and how to approach advocacy issues practically by using SMART technique and the 9 pillars of advocacy. We also looked at monitoring, evaluating, and learning framework of advocacy plan and how to draft an advocacy roadmap. So here we were all busy putting together the advocacy roadmap. So what is an advocacy roadmap? An advocacy roadmap is a roadmap to address advocacy issues related to global targets, decriminalization, and harm reduction in South Africa. The roadmap is intended to help networks and organizations to address the challenges at the national and local levels, empower community groups, and challenge government as duty bearers ultimately. It's intended to ensure that people who use drugs, their families and communities can realize their human rights and achieve their health. The overall objective goal is to enable people who use drugs to have a greater human rights protection, reduce vulnerability, increase access to harm reduction and comprehensive health services in South Africa by 2027. Okay, so the priorities, issues identified were the consequences of the decriminalization of drug use and the need for full decriminalization, the limited access to harm reduction services, particularly for women who use drugs, human rights violations experienced by people who use drugs, by policies and law enforcement, including violence and the confiscation of personal belongings, injecting equipment, and medication. Advocacy objectives. To move towards the decriminalization of drug use, a position of small amounts for personal use in South Africa by 2027, to advocate for the achievement of the Global AIDS Strategy on harm reduction targets for people who use drugs in South Africa by 2025, and to ensure that less than 10% of people who use drugs experience stigma and discrimination at community healthcare services by 2025. Thank you.